All right, I think most everyone is here, so let's get started. I'm Pam Kennedy, a research analyst with the Stimson Center's East Asia program, and I'm so happy to welcome you to the launch of Stimson's new report, Taiwan Security Brief 2020. We'll be dropping the link in the chat so you can browse it at your leisure. This is a new collection of 3 articles examining different aspects of Taiwan in 2020, including US-Taiwan relations under the Trump administration, the developments in cross-Strait relations this year, and Taiwan's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. It was my personal pleasure to organize the project with Yuki Tatsumi, our East Asia program co-director, as my mentor, and I brought on board 2 rising experts to author the report with me, and I'll introduce them now. So Eleanor Albert is a Ph.D. in residence at the International Security and Conflict Studies Center at the Elliott School, while working toward her Ph.D. in political science at George Washington University. She was previously the Asia writer for the explanatory journalism arm of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Her research interests include Chinese foreign and domestic policy, China's participation in global governance, and how the country exerts its influence and builds relationships. Then we have Emily Chen. She is a PhD candidate in the Graduate School of Interdisciplinary Information Studies and a research affiliate in the Institute for Advanced Studies on Asia at the University of Tokyo. Recently, she was a non-resident WSD Honda Fellow with the Pacific Forum. She studies and writes on cross-strait relations, international relations of East Asia, US policy toward Northeast Asia, and the role and influence of liberal democracy in the context of international politics. And as I said, I'm Pam Kennedy. I've been with the Stimson Center for 4 years in the East Asia program, and for the past 2 years, it's been my honor to work on the Taiwan project. So I'm really happy to have joined these authors in writing these articles for your interest. Today, my fellow authors and I will discuss our papers for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll transition to question and answers. So for the Q&A, please submit questions to the Q&A box and specify which panelist the question is for so that we can organize it more easily. So, Eleanor, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much, Pam. I want to first thank you, the Stimson Center, and the East Asia program for the invitation to participate in this project, and I've been really looking forward to today's discussion. So I'm going to start off with some brief context for US-Taiwan relations, and then I'll look at some of the steps undertaken to diversify these ties, and I'll conclude with some recommendations for the road ahead. So when the US opted to sever formal relations with Taipei in favor of diplomatic ties with Beijing, it also passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which includes provisions for the US to maintain commercial, cultural, and other relations with the people of Taiwan. And this was intended to help maintain peace, security, and stability in the region. Now, today, US-Taiwan relations are also symbolic for Taiwan's relations with other actors by helping to shape how the island manages ties with other like-minded and Western states. This is especially true when Washington pursues some degree of coalition building to advocate for exchanges with the island, and also to advocate for Taiwanese observer status in multilateral organizations. Still, though, the pressure from Beijing always looms large. Beijing and Taipei are still in competition for diplomatic partners. And since Xi's rise to power and Tsai's first election, a number of countries have cut their ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing, while Beijing also continues to exert pressure internally within international organizations to exclude the island's participation. So this diplomatic squeezing has also been coupled with other efforts. Beijing's military modernization has been leveraged to try and dissuade leaders in Taiwan from pushing the bounds of the autonomy it maintains. It's done so with tactics ranging from sending bombers, fighters, surveillance aircraft to patrol the island, as well as conducting, pretty advanced military drills. And Beijing also engages in a degree of influence campaigns to try and sway public opinion. And despite all of this, there's also a growing sense of skepticism and distrust of Beijing and Taiwan. And this is correlated with increasingly positive Taiwanese attitudes towards the United States. And this trend is acute among the island's younger generations. So against this backdrop, US-Taiwan ties seem to have reached a high point under the Trump administration. These have typically been sustained in a more behind closed doors fashion, but Trump took a different approach. And under his administration, the US's Taiwan policy evolved along kind of three broad tracks. So you have security, expanded exchanges, and economic ties. So on the security side, arms sales experienced an uptick. Trump approved weapons sales totaling more than $15 billion, including the sale of F-16 jets, advanced torpedoes, support for a radar system, among other things. Taiwan is also featured prominently in some Pentagon reports where it was described as a reliable, capable, and natural partner. And then naval passages through the Taiwan Strait also became more routine. But the island's ties, the US's ties to the island are not just constrained to this military security or material security realm, and they're also not only managed by the executive branch or the military. Legislatively, the 2018 Taiwan Travel Act paved a legal path to expand exchanges between US and Taiwanese officials at multiple levels. And then the 2019 Taipei Act, which became law this spring, is designed to try and strengthen Taiwan's relationships and partnerships with other countries and as its role as a participant in international organizations. This bill also requires that the State Department provide an annual report to Congress to outline steps that have been taken to try and achieve this goal. Now, on top of that, other exchanges have taken place with Trump cabinet members visiting Taiwan, including Alex Azar this past August. And it made him the first in his position as the Secretary of Health and Human Services to travel to Taiwan, and he was the highest ranking cabinet member since 1979. So the third track, economic exchanges between Taiwan and the United States have also shown promise recently. Earlier this year, Taiwan eased restrictions on imports of US pork and beef, which had kind of long been seen as a major stumbling point to blocking a trade agreement. And Taiwanese leaders have also continued their interest in joining the now CPTPP, which is led by Japan after the Trump administration withdrew the US from TPP. There have also been other developments on the economic front. You've had the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the world's largest manufacturer of chips, announced plans to build a chip factory in Phoenix. And other US firms like Apple and Google have also reciprocated, increasing their operations in Taiwan. Now, a lot of these policy developments have not always had their intended effect. Sometimes the strong publicity surrounding either US Navy passages, arms sales, and these high-profile visits may well have pushed Beijing to kind of be bolder in their response on their end. And ultimately, when it comes to US-Taiwan policy, there are no choices without consequences. The shadow of Beijing's hostility, always has been and remains very real. But ultimately, US officials should approach their relationship with Taipei on its own grounds and not merely as a residual component of US-China relations. So finally, some brief recommendations. So first, the US should continue to advocate more proactively for international organizations and other partners to engage with Taiwan. And this should continue even if they aren't necessarily successful. This will also require the US to kind of revitalize its own disposition towards multilateralism. Second, officials should continue routine visits with their relevant counterparts, and exchanges should also build off of the success of previous platforms where Taiwan has been able to share some of its expertise in areas of public health, law enforcement, disaster relief, among others. Now, there are signs that a trade agreement could be making progress. There's long been a conversation about it, but they should commit to negotiating something, as a deal would not just boost trade volume, but it could also help to reduce vulnerabilities in global supply chains. Now, for a more robust relationship between Washington and Taipei, the regression of US-China relations will likely need to abate. And even though there are fears in Taipei that too close of a US-China relationship could damage the island's interests, the declining state of Sino-US dynamics really guarantees that any US outreach to the island is viewed in this way as just a move to spite Beijing. And cross-strait relations should also come to a better position. There've been a lot of channels of communication that either been stuck. And while US officials themselves might not be positioned to promote this cross-strait dialogue, there are opportunities for non-governmental channels and track to engagement to serve as alternatives. And finally, the US and Taiwan should sustain a range of security cooperation from training to arms sales, but with a bit less fanfare. Given the state of cross-strait tensions, overly public defense cooperation between the US and Taiwan can actually be a double-edged sword, benefiting the island in an immediate sense, but ultimately worsening cross-strait relations and exacerbating existing military tensions. Now, as the US and the world await the transition from a Trump to Biden administration, there are concerns that there might be a more conciliatory approach in Washington toward Beijing, and that could spell disaster. But as Beijing signaled, or as Biden signaled in an op-ed in October, he really intends the US to stand with friends and allies in Asia. And he articulated explicitly that this includes deeper ties with Taiwan, which he had described as a leading democracy and major economy. Now, we likely won't know more on the direction of a Biden administration towards Taiwan ties until his national security team is formed. And so that's just something we'll likely have to wait and see how things play out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. Emily? You're muted.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Pam. Let me get my slides ready. Okay. Okay. So yes, so it is a real privilege to be a part of this project. And it is especially meaningful to me that this project is to continue the legacy of Ellen, who took a leap of faith and gave me my first internship in the US and made it his business to continue to mentor me and encourage me over the years. So thank you, Yuki, Pam, and Jason for this great opportunity. So my share of this project looks at recent developments in cross-strait relations, specifically how Taiwan's posture toward China could be reshaped by the COVID-19 pandemic. So before diving into the discussion of Taiwan's current and future cross-strait posture, I would like to start by noting two developments in the pre-pandemic era that I think are important and I believe have continued to guide the overall direction of Taiwan's policy toward China today. So first, over the past 3 years, Taipei has begun to think that the pressure from Beijing will only intensify no matter how moderate or consistent its posture towards Beijing may be intended, meaning despite President Tsai's policy of non-provocation and maintaining the status quo. So from Taipei's perspective, whether and how Taiwan can look beyond China to develop itself and break out of its restricted international space continue to be urgent issues in need of solutions. And while Taipei struggles with its constrained international space, there is some good news. And this is the second point. Taipei has seen an international political climate that has grown increasingly favorable to itself. That is, in recent years, a growing group of liberal democracies has taken a stance against Beijing's internal policies and Beijing's attempts at expanding its global ambitions. So now, with the outbreak of the COVID-19 global health crisis, these winds against China have not abated. Within months, we have seen liberal democracies criticize Beijing's handling of the initial outbreak and subsequent virus spread, as well as Beijing's efforts to try to control the global narrative and restore its reputation by reportedly spreading disinformation and by sending aid packages worldwide. And now as the pandemic continues to grow, and so does this wins against China, it may open up some breathing space for Taiwan and the international community. So with that, my paper hopes to explore three main questions around Taiwan's cross-strait posture in the post-pandemic era. So what has Taipei attempted to do to make the most out of this favorable political environment to advance its international standing vis-a-vis China? And how has Beijing responded? And moving forward, should Taipei continue to resist Beijing by relying on the current political climate, or engage it to improve the embittered relationship and gain more significant international space? So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is hit on 4 highlights of my paper. And if time allows, we can go into greater detail during the Q&A session. So first, some of the observations about how Taipei is gaining capital from the pandemic. It has been rather clear to many observers, and therefore I won't go into details here, that Taipei is making the most of a new pandemic-struck international community to seek broader international space. But as for using the pandemic to gain political leverage over Beijing, Taipei appears to have shown some restraints. When I say restraint, I do not intend to argue that Taipei is not trying to jump at the chance to gain the upper hand over Beijing when the current political climate offers Taipei the potential to do so. In fact, there are signs that Taipei is building on this growing Western skepticism of China's ambitions to stoke the world against China sentiment during the pandemic. In Foreign Minister Joseph Wu's words, when everybody is getting very busy and dealing with the pandemic, the Chinese government seems to be trying to expand and trying to take actions in many places around the world. Places he referred to were Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the South and the East China Seas. That being said, there is still reason to believe that Taipei intends to maintain a non-provocative stance. One example is Taipei's adjustment to the virus name. So when the disease broke out in Taiwan in January, Taipei joined many countries in calling the novel coronavirus the Wuhan coronavirus, to indicate the Chinese city from which the virus allegedly originated. Unsurprisingly, Beijing was not pleased about the moniker. But after the WHO declared in February an official name for the disease, COVID-19, Taipei has gradually adjusted its official vocabulary to reflect that change, and to some extent, avoiding provoking Beijing. And secondly, about the current state of the cross-strait relations. The pandemic is creating more friction in an already soured cross-strait relations because both Taipei and Beijing accuse each other of taking advantage of the pandemic for political gain. So while Taipei has criticized Beijing for expanding its global ambitions despite the pandemic, as mentioned earlier, Beijing has attacked Taipei for exploiting the pandemic to seek independence. And at the core of Beijing's frustration is Taipei's fierce campaign to seek inclusion in the WHO system and network, now with the increasingly expressed support from many like-minded democratic countries. But could this rising international support help Taiwan obtain a role in the WHO? And so far, it seems that the current level of international backing of Taiwan does little to pressure the WHO to grant Taiwan a place in its international forum. This is evident in Taipei's failed attempt to join the WHO meetings as an observer in May and again this month. So to Beijing, the crux of Taipei's inability to participate in the WHO system lies in Taipei's pushing for independence. And only when Taipei's gained its trust first will it accommodate its international aspirations. So what's the next phase of cross-strait relations? In order to gain more significant international space, should Taipei try to engage Beijing to improve the relationship? Today, while the increased tension between the West and China, a comprehensive engagement policy with China seems to have dropped off the table. And a number of recent developments in Taiwan could also make an engagement policy with China seem unlikely, such as a stronger sense of a Taiwan pride coming out of the pandemic, and an increase in the percentage of people who see China as unfriendly toward both the Taiwan government and its people, as well as the opposition party KMT stepping back from its regular exchanges with China through the cross-Strait forum this September. On the other hand, trying to resist Beijing's pressure by solely relying on the current political environment against China can also be risky. After all, it is still unclear how much tangible support Taiwan's democratic partners are willing and able to offer to help create more space for Taiwan in international organizations, and more importantly, how effective the support could be. But what is certain is that partnerships with democratic countries will unavoidably harden Beijing's resolve to continue to block Taiwan's access to international space. This leads to the last point I would like to make today. To resist Beijing's increased pressure and resolve to deny its access to international space, strengthening Taipei's cooperation with allies, old and new, has never been more necessary and urgent. But as the sustainability and impacts of the international support still remain to be seen, Taiwan will also need to continue to prove itself as a relevant and indispensable member in the international community. In the last part of my paper, I have identified 3 potential roles that Taiwan, in the second term of Tsai's presidency, can actively play in the international community. Roles include advocate for global healthcare, for freedom and human rights, and for global concerns and problems, such as recycling that Taiwan struggled with at home, but is now leading the world in solving. So with that, thank you, and I'll turn it over to Pam.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you both for those really informative presentations, and hopefully I will also be able to meet that standard. So finally, I'll briefly discuss my paper, which is titled Taiwan's Domestic Policy Response to COVID-19, Balancing Security and Democracy. And the inspiration obviously came from early in the pandemic. It was clear that Taiwan was expertly containing the spread of COVID-19 within its borders, and I decided to take a deep dive into Taiwan's policy response and how that response has been received by the public, because I think there's a lot of lessons that the rest of the world can take from Taiwan's example. As of yesterday, November 11th, Taiwan has had a total of 584 confirmed cases and only 7 deaths. This performance is among the best in the world by any metric. Taiwan does have some natural advantages, such as being an island, which means it's easier to enforce border controls compared to land borders. But Taiwan is also no stranger to epidemics. It's experienced SARS, H1N1, dengue fever. So what is Taiwan doing right? Taiwan based its policy response on lessons learned, in particular during the SARS epidemic of 2002 to 2004. Taiwan did manage to contain the SARS outbreak, of course, using many of the policies that have worked with COVID-19 today. But its response suffered in several respects. There were missteps in public communication and government policies. There was sensationalist media coverage that contributed to stigmatizing the disease. There was insufficient preparation for the medical system and a general lack of preparedness in society, which all resulted in an atmosphere of panic as the disease spread rapidly across Taiwan. There was even a face mask shortage, which may surprise everyone today now that we know that Taiwan's production capacity is in the tens of millions of face masks per day. But a major issue was really Taiwan's institutional structure for dealing with SARS. The Centers for Disease Control had been established only in 1999, and it did not have centralized authority to manage the policy approach. Taiwan initially struggled to get the WHO to travel to Taiwan and advise on the situation, but they eventually did receive recommendations from the WHO as well as the United States' own CDC. And this information and these recommendations were used to completely overhaul its system. So in 2004, the National Health Command Center, which includes the Central Epidemic Command Center, which is the central point of contact for all communications between Taiwan's authorities, was established. And the healthcare system, likewise, was prepared and conducts regular drills for future epidemics to ensure that hospitals can manage the surge in patients. And finally, perhaps most importantly, the public learned the hygiene measures necessary to control disease spread and figured out how to cooperate with local and federal authorities on contact tracing. So with more than 15 years of preparation and practice in place, Taiwan's response to COVID-19 this year, well, actually last year, started early with information gathering and cautionary measures. They began screening passengers on direct flights from Wuhan as early as December 31st. And then the response escalated in mid-January. So on January 15th, the government declared the disease a Class 5 infectious disease. On the 20th, they activated the Central Epidemic Command Center. And on the 22nd, the National Security Council held a meeting on COVID-19. And that was the prelude to a rollout of, comprehensive policies that covered everything from disease control measures like travel restrictions and quarantines to managing the economic fallout with stimulus packages. And the legal basis for these exceptional measures was the February 25th Special Act for Prevention and Relief and Revitalization Measures. In my research, I noted that this act is extremely important because during SARS, there had been questions about the constitutionality of some measures like quarantines. Remember that the SARS outbreak occurred less than 2 decades after Taiwan transitioned away from authoritarianism. So it was really important that there was constitutionality in the government's response to prevent a backsliding into sort of management during a crisis by authoritarian means. So this special act for COVID has provided a time boundary for pandemic policies. It does expire next June. And it's also allowed President Tsai to avoid an emergency declaration that would come with broader powers for the government. And finally, to make this raft of policies work, of course, the most important part has been public cooperation, which Tsai's government has received. I've checked numerous surveys, and they show that for the most part, the public has been supportive of the measures. There's also proof of that in the fact that out of the several 100,000 people who have undergone quarantine for periods of time, the rate of breaking quarantine is extremely low, less than 1%. Of course, as the pandemic has dragged on, there is still concern about whether the policy measures are violating privacy rights. This comes down to a technology question. There's no doubt that Taiwan's use of technology during the pandemic has been beneficial. You have actually probably heard of the apps that were made by civic-minded programmers and engineers in Taiwan that helped people find pharmacies with available face masks under Taiwan's rationing system early in the pandemic when the face mask production was still being ramped up. But the tech is also used to monitor individuals in quarantine, and 2 databases, the National Health Insurance Database and the Immigrations and Customs Database, have actually been integrated to help hospitals do contact tracing and check patients for travel history that might have been to sensitive places with COVID outbreaks. These measures have helped Taiwan avoid the need for mass testing, but they have also been criticized as intrusive by activists. And the government has stated that the practice will be discontinued after the pandemic, but when will that occur? We are almost a full year into the pandemic with no end in sight until a vaccine arrives. So people want to know, how will they know for certain? I think that the fact that there is an open discussion of these issues of freedom and rights is a hallmark of Taiwan's robust democracy. But since government and society are both grappling with the reality that the situation could endure for months, it will be important for the government to continue to present the justifications for its policies and keep cultivating trust with the public through transparency. I have kept my recommendations brief because Taiwan's response to the pandemic has been so assured, swift, and effective that it's very difficult to sit here in the United States and recommend that Taiwan do anything different. Instead, as Taiwan continues to model an ideal pandemic response, I'm recommending that Taiwan show the world how to manage the concerns of its public, which are concerns that folks in other countries will also share, where we're testing apps for contact tracing and so forth. First, Taiwan should reinforce public confidence in the policy response through developing an exit strategy of sorts that defines how to transition away from the pandemic response. This might help people who are suffering from fatigue during this long period of restrictions, but help them keep continuing to comply with the policies. Taiwan should also respond to concerns about data collection and monitoring by preparing to have an independent third party, like an international NGO, verify the end of the use of monitoring technologies and the deletion of collected data when the time comes to end those technologies' use. Even if making plans for that now seems very premature when we might only be halfway through the pandemic, it would help to reassure the public. And finally, we need to keep sharing Taiwan's expertise. And on further reflection, I think this is not only the responsibility of Taiwan, because the government has been very active in sharing its experiences and methods with international audiences during the pandemic. But Taiwan's friends, like the United States, also need to amplify Taiwan's good example and actively learn from it so that we can alleviate the suffering that has occurred during the pandemic and bring the disease under control. The obvious platform is the Global Cooperation and Training Framework that the United States shares with Taiwan and some other coast countries like Japan. Taiwan has set a gold standard for disease preparedness, and hopefully by learning from Taiwan, more of the world will be ready for the next pandemic. Taiwan has shown, as Emily says in her paper, that it is helping, and the rest of the world can be receptive to these lessons. And with that, those are the end of my remarks. We can move to the Q&A. We have a first question for Emily. Do you think that a cross-strait conflict will occur before January 20th when the new US president takes office? Why or why not? And a follow-on question is, with the PLA's increased military exercises and operations in the Strait, are there signs that Beijing is gearing up for an attack?
Okay, thank you, Pam, and thank you for the questions. Perhaps I will just frame the question, answer the question this way, because the question is more about cross-strait conflict and Beijing's possible attack on Taiwan. So at this moment, perhaps the question could be answered this way. Has China reached to the point where the peaceful option for unification with Taiwan is completely off the table, and only that military action can achieve unification? Could Beijing justify an immense cost that comes with a war, not only in lives, money, and its reputation now? So what I can see at this moment is that Beijing is still adopting a carrot and stick approach toward Taiwan. And of course, we're now seeing more stick than carrot recently, with the frequent military presence around Taiwan. But I think Beijing will continue to control Taiwan through military threats, diplomatic isolation, and economic incentives, a combination of various strategies. But I think what we should be aware of today is the possibility of a military contingency caused by the miscalculation from China. And there has been a growing consensus in the US that the current level of US deterrence in the Taiwan Strait is insufficient in facing China's increased threats in its military buildup. And I think, Eleanor, maybe you will have more thoughts on that. And there are many deterrence options, whether it is a clear security guarantee from the US as proposed by some experts, regularized arms sales, or simply the US making explicit to China serious consequences of attacking Taiwan. And that Taiwan does need to work with the US and other partners like Japan on that. So I guess that's my thoughts.
Eleanor, would you like to add some thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I agree very much with Emily's comments, and I agree that, you know, conflict is not in the interest of most of these actors, right? And so there are going to be many steps taken to try and prevent that take place, whether it's, you know, lives lost, economic consequences, all of that. So I do think that a lot of it depends on the way that ties move forward. I think that we're in a precarious situation now where relations between the three kind of nodes in this area are all quite strained. And, you know, Taiwan seems to actually be the more stable presence at this stage in terms of being unmoving in the position that it's taken. You know, it is not trying to provoke anything. And, you know, on the reverse side, the US has been much more, I wouldn't say emboldened, but more telegraphy in the way in which it is recognizing certain facets of its relationship with Taiwan. And Beijing, on the flip side, has been, you know, equally bold in trying to signal that you know, it doesn't want any lines crossed. So I think there aren't really ways to move forward in the current state where we're really kind of blocked in a precarious situation. And so I think it'll take real work to try and de-escalate tensions for there to be an easing of the tension. And there'll be a lot of attention towards this region, but I still think that the actual risk of an intentional conflict is low. But it's the possibility of a miscalculation that always kind of is what people try and develop contingencies.
Thank you. We have a question from Mike Fonte. Thanks for joining us today, Mike. The Global Cooperation and Training Framework seeks to provide sessions where Taiwan's experience and resources are made available. How do you see these programs supporting Taiwan's international presence? And so this question is for Emily, but I think we all discussed the GCTF in our papers. So let's start with Emily and then we'll go around.
Okay, so I think GCTF is a very important platform for Taiwan in a post-pandemic era. And because it is not new for Taiwan to seek recognition and presence in the broader international space by emphasizing its practical contributions to the world. But the current global health crisis has made Taiwan's contribution today more visible and valued. So I think the GCTF forum will be regarded as will attract more attention in that way. And in my paper, I actually talked about three possible potential roles. And one is especially the global healthcare and the concept of digital like healthcare, universal healthcare, and the vision of digital universal healthcare is also very important and credited for its role in Taiwan's combating COVID-19. And freedom and human rights issues, and also specifically the gender equality issues can also be a main topic for the GCTF forum in the future. And last but not least, as I mentioned earlier, the recycling issues that also is a very critical issues in the world that is a global concern. And I think that the world can benefit from Taiwan's experience.
Eleanor, did you want to add anything on GCTF?
Sure. I think one of the main benefits of a forum or framework of this type is that it can emphasize, really transnational issues that kind of affect all communities and are cross-border issues. And having those type of subject matters be a way that Taiwan can contribute helps, helps in the dissemination of its experiences in a way that is somewhat more depoliticized. Because they're kind of macro level concerns. And so on top of that, I think there are issues of, digital media literacy that can also play a role. And that can also help reinforce, the ways in which Taiwan as a democracy has been able to manage certain types of pressures in a highly digitized and technological media era.
I completely agree. And I think this year, there have already been several GCTF meetings held on the topic of COVID-19. So in my research, it's a natural avenue for getting Taiwan's experience out to the international community, especially to partners who are already receptive to lessons that can be learned from Taiwan's expertise on various topics. I think that GCTF is important for supporting Taiwan's international presence because it does amplify that type of specialized people-to-people exchange between experts in a wide variety of fields, from the sciences to social sciences and other areas. We have another question to all the panelists. Do you have a sense of how people in Taiwan are perceiving eventual reunification, especially given what's happening in Hong Kong at the moment? And what does this mean for the future of Taiwan? I can start. Survey data does show that the Hong Kong situation has created some concern in Taiwan about what one country, two systems means in practice. If Hong Kong, which should technically be only halfway through its period of semi-autonomy, is already seeing its semi-autonomous rights eroded. So for Taiwan, that is creating concerns about what Beijing's eventual intentions for Taiwan sort of really are. I think that has perhaps cooled some views on eventual reunification, but the important thing to remember in terms of how folks in Taiwan view the mainland is that there's still a really strong desire to maintain the status quo. And I think that does come from a feeling of uncertainty about international relations all across the world. We're at a time where there are a lot of factors in international politics that are changing. And I think people are waiting to see what will happen. Emily, what is your perspective on this?
Oh, yes, I completely agree with you, with Pan, on that front, and also the survey. There's actually a lot of there are surveys about that. And perhaps I would comment on KMT's stance on China, because KMT's stance on China was used to be labeled as pro-engagement. But these days, I've seen some adjustments to KMT's adjustments to its policy toward China, and that might reflect the changes in the Taiwanese society. So, of course, there has been an ongoing debate within the KMT, mostly along generational lines, about the party's stance toward China. And the older generation still holds on to the 1992 consensus, but the younger generations, represented by the current KMT chair, Johnny Jiang, hopes to modify the stance and seek possible alternatives to keep up with the times. But so under this current KMT leadership, there are actually signs that KMT has been making adjustments to its stance on China. And I believe that is to try to win the support from the Taiwanese public. And we see KMT not shy away from condemning China of its frequent military presence around Taiwan and demanding apologies from China on characterizing KMT's initially planned visit to China in September as a trip to beg for peace. And more importantly, I think Eleanor mentioned about Pam, sorry. KMT sponsored two resolutions in the legislature, both passed unanimously in October, seeking stronger diplomatic ties and military aid from the US, which was criticized by Beijing. So I think that from looking at the KMT's adjustments to its stance on China, we can see that the reflects the Taiwan's society and people's view in Taiwan.
Yeah, just to add a little bit on that, I completely agree with what both Emily and Pam have said. And I think, it's important to remember that, this one country, two systems was originally designed to be used for Taiwan, but obviously has never gotten to that point. And that there is a real evolution among Taiwanese society in terms of their sense of identity. There's lots of surveys done both in Hong Kong and in Taiwan about, the idea of how you identify as individuals, whether you see yourself as uniquely Taiwanese or as a Hong Konger, or if there's some mix of being Chinese and Hong Konger along with those. And in both of these situations, we see, really increasing unique identities for these separate areas. And that is particularly strong with younger generations. And I think that in a time where Beijing is taking a bolder stance, that can only continue. So I think, it'll be interesting as we see, political leadership evolve and have new voices coming into politics in Taiwan.
Thank you. We have another question for Eleanor, actually. For the Biden administration, it's expected that the administration will maintain strong support for Taiwan, but what will the priorities be? Security, bilateral trade agreement, CPTPP?
Yeah, I think as my recommendations in the paper hope to represent is I think that for a robust relationship, we need to be advancing on kind of multiple fronts so that the relationship isn't siloed and so that it is more dynamic. That being said, I wouldn't anticipate, significant changes in the way in which the US relationship with Taiwan has evolved. I would say there'll be priorities on multiple fronts. Defense will certainly be there. I think it'll be a difference kind of in style and approach of how these things take place. I wouldn't say that we'll likely see, advanced statements about some of these trainings coming. Arms sales might change in the types of arms that are sold or quantities. And that might be a reflection not just of a US approach, but a reassessment on the Taiwanese side of what they actually think they need as they develop a different type of defense strategy. As far as economics go, I do, on later, I think it's in maybe 10 days, 2 weeks, there's going to be, under the Trump administration, there's a new initiative to talk about the economic prosperity dialogue. I think, I'm not sure exactly the exact name of it, but that's set to kind of set the stage for greater discussions about the future of the US economic relationship with Taiwan. I anticipate that will continue. And as for CPTPP, I think that as it stands will be much more continue to be an Asian-centric, Japan-led initiative, and we'll see how the Biden administration plays out. I know there's kind of been shifting ground on the role of kind of big multilateral trade agreements in the Democratic Party and on the progressive side. So we'll see that. That's kind of a remaining question mark.
That's great, thank you. We have a question for all panelists. What do you think has been the lasting legacy of the Trump administration for Taiwan, for the US-Taiwan relationship, I guess? What has the Trump administration changed within the bilateral or the trilateral relationship for good?
So I can take a first stab at this, as this is kind of the thrust of my paper. And I think it has progressed on kind of two fronts. And so the Trump administration, I think, has renewed or injected kind of new energy into the US-Taiwan relationship. But I have to kind of caveat it and say I don't know that it's necessarily, you know, fired on all cylinders in the right way, because it hasn't necessarily always disaggregated the intent of the policies from the effects of the US-China relationship. And so I think that has been, it's muddied this water between, you know, substance and symbolism in the way in which we'll see the relationship move forward. You know, I don't think that it is beneficial for our partners that we work with in Taiwan to think of the relationship as being just this instrument that gets used in kind of poking Beijing. And so for it to be more durable and not vulnerable to manipulation, it needs to be kind of segmented away from that. So I think that will be kind of a big task for a Biden administration to really clarify beyond the way in which Taiwan fits into its foreign policy in Asia in general, and not just as a subsection of kind of greater China strategy.
Okay. So I just wanted to add it to that and perhaps comment on the legacy part. And as we can see, as both Eleanor and Pam also mentioned, that in the US we can see is there's a rather robust support for defending Taiwan and the value of democracy and human rights from the public elites, and it is partisan in the Trump administration. And there are actually a lot of mechanisms, institutionalized efforts in place that will help the continuity of the current US-Taiwan engagement, such as the regularized arms sales and several pro-Taiwan bills. So I think in that sense, if we're talking about legacy or something that's beneficial for Taiwan, in this US Taiwan relationship, I would say that these mechanisms, institutionalized efforts could bring more predictability in the future US-Taiwan relations. And that might be something that's good, beneficial for both Taiwan and the United States.
I agree. I think that the best part of US-Taiwan relations over the past 4 years is that it has continued a positive trajectory of deepening engagement, deepening the people-to-people exchanges, both at higher levels as well as at just the level of ordinary citizens. But I do think that I agree with Eleanor. Sometimes the handling has been inelegant or not nuanced enough to really put Taiwan's interests in the best position that the US could in order to support Taiwan's democracy and Taiwan's economic position, so many different facets of the relationship. So I think that going forward under the Biden administration, we'll really be looking for the development of more nuance so that Taiwan is doesn't feel and doesn't act like a little pawn on the board in the Indo-Pacific, because it is so much more important to the United States and its friends around the world than that. We have a question for Eleanor. There's been recent discussion among American scholars about rethinking the US's traditional approach of strategic ambiguity. So if a cross-strait conflict were to occur, what do you view as the US's commitment to defending Taiwan militarily? How does the US public think about this?
This is the million-dollar question, right? And I think, as I tried to suggest in my remarks a little bit, I do actually think that revisiting strategic ambiguity might do more harm down the road in a longer term perspective, rather than having some type of communication that comes from, kind of sustained and kind of more developed defense cooperation. So I'm not trying to punt the question, but I just think that it's not in anyone's best interest necessarily. I mean, that would be crossing a line, I think, in the delicate legal and diplomatic framework that allow the US to maintain, a degree of robust unofficial relations with Taiwan and maintain relations with China. So I do think that kind of shifting an approach would be dangerous. Now, that being said, defense cooperation should still be a really important pillar of the unofficial ties, and that can go from training to different types of training. It doesn't just have to be, the US sending a ship through the Taiwan Strait. There should be much more discussion among, how do you develop contingencies and thinking about things like that. And as far as the US public, I think we've really seen a souring towards Beijing in the United States. And, there's been a lot of discussion about a bipartisan consensus of being kind of negative on China. Now that being said, we really can't afford to enter an era where we don't interact with China in any positive fronts. It's a complex relationship. And so I think, I also think the US is pretty wary at this stage of any type of military conflict abroad, and that would be a really difficult sell in the event of some, extreme crisis. So I think it's in everyone's interest to really work their hardest to avoid that scenario from playing out.
A great answer to, a really tough question, the million-dollar question. We will have one last question briefly for Emily. And this has several parts. I'm just going to pick the first part, but how is society in Taiwan reacting to the US's unprecedented pressure on China in 2020? Are those moves welcomed?
Always forgot to unmute. So I guess the question is about Taiwan's, whether perhaps the choosing sides problem that I would say that in the context of the ongoing US-China tensions, people in Taiwan have expressed reservations about taking the side of the United States. So in a survey conducted by Taiwan, I think Taiwan Indicators survey research in September, so while about 60% of the respondents said they feel an affinity for the US, when it comes to the question asking them to choose sides between the United States or China, only 24% favor closer ties with the United States. About 70% prefer staying neutral. So in that sense, we can see that Taiwan does not want to be, or at least the Taiwan public does not want to be put in a situation where it has to take sides between the United States and China. And the public in Taiwan does not want to see the ongoing US-China tensions that can actually put Taiwan in a very difficult situation.
Thank you. And we have almost exactly hit 9 a.m. Eastern here. So thank you so much to our panelists for joining, my fellow authors, Eleanor and Emily. I hope you will all in the audience go and read Taiwan Security Brief 2020 to get a deeper dive into these analyses. And thank you so much for joining us, whether you're joining us during the night in Asia or morning here on the East Coast of the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you.